Thank you so much for having me. I'm extremely excited to present this work and also to join the discussion with all of you. So this is a recent research paper that I've been doing with my colleague and also a professor here at Xiaodao at Harris. We try to understand and try to describe what policy experimentation looks like in China and try to draw some lessons for political economy of conducting policy learning at the massive scale. Okay? So figuring out which policy to implement and how to implement those policies has been one of the most important challenges that governments around the world are facing. This is true throughout history and certainly probably becoming even truer today given the policy is getting more and more complicated. Now, government over time has figured out different ways to learn about policy and how to implement them, simply ranging from simple tried and error to sort of slightly more sophisticated, sort of sequentially rolling out policy and evaluation to the very sort of sophisticated randomized control trials that started across many government bodies over the last decade or so. Okay. Now, if you look at sort of a systematic efforts for governments to try to engage in policy learning through experimentation, probably by far the most systematic and sort of the largest scale version that sort of has the longest duration is probably the institutional policy experimentation in China started in 1980. Okay. In particular, there's an institution in China called From Point to Surface, which is starting from 1980. Many of the major policies that government would like to introduce didn't go through become national policy right away. The central government of China sort of tried the policy in a couple of places in China first, and after on average 4 to 5 years, the government decided to evaluate the policy and decide whether they want to roll out the whole policy to the entire country. Okay? This particular institution of policy experimentation, many scholars over the last sort of decades have speculated to be the reason why China has reformed fairly gradually and avoided many major policy disasters. Okay? Now, we don't sort of until now have a very good sort of sense of what this experimentation looks like, how many things government has tried, what do they learn out of the experimentation, what are the structure of the experimentation, and so on. So what we try to do in this particular project is try to collect some data, try to understand, and try to describe these experimentation, and try to hopefully draw some lessons, some both positive lessons and also sort of potentially sort of cautious lessons from this particular experience that China has been engaging over the last 40 years and still ongoing. Okay. Just to fix ideas, I want to show you a couple of sort of concrete examples of the experimentations that the government is trying, and these are going to be sort of included in the database that we're going to examine. So I want you to focus on the left panel here, right panel here. This is one reform where government sort of is trying to introduce a separation of business licenses and permits, which is meant to ease the starting of a new business in China. This particular reform was first introduced in 2015, tried out in a few places in China, and it gradually sort of rolled out in 3 different waves during the trial period. So for during the period of 2015 to 2018. And then by the end of the trial period, after the 3rd wave, the government decided, okay, this is the policy, we'd like to make a national one, and then they become a national policy after 2018. Okay. On the bottom panel here, I'm showing you 2 other examples. Again, focus on the right-hand side as the example. This is a reform that central government sort of tried to introduce more fiscal autonomy to the lowest level of the government in China, which is the county government. The reform is allowing the county government to bypass the city government above the county level to have more discretion on how they allocate the budgets, and sort of they don't need to directly control by the prefectural government. Okay. This particular reform was first introduced or tried out in a few places in 2002. And then gradually over the next a decade or so, it was tried out in 10 different waves involving half of China, about 1,200 counties. And then by the end of the 10th wave of the reform, government decided this is not a policy we want to roll out to the whole country, and then they roll back. Okay, so we're going to call this sort of a trial that does not lead to a national policy. It was a trial that lead to a policy that sort of quote unquote failed. Yep. Yeah, so the dark red here is for if the policy was tried out in a county, those are the counties that are being tried, and the pink red, the pink color is the sort of the provincial government who are being allocated to a province. This is one level above, which I'm going to come back to this in a second. But here you can already see some hints that for the policy that get rolled out to the rest of to the entire country and only tried out in the few sort of places, it was mostly coastal places that who gets the trial. And by the time you get in policy like this, in the trial experimentation like this, where a larger fraction of the countries are being tried, you start moving away from just the coastal area, then the inland of the country starts to experience the new learning as well. So this is going to be important of part of the story I will present. Okay, so this is just to give you a flavor. So what we wanted to do in this project is that we want to sort of collect a bit more data and try to do this sort of the cases a bit more systematically. In particular, we sort of would try to gather data for all the experimentation that China has been doing over the last 4 decades and all the trials and generate some patterns. Now we want to focus on 2 particular characteristics of the experimentation, because think about if you were trying to draw some signals about how effective a policy is from the trial, there are typically 2 important features that one should pay attention to in terms of how you want to structure the experimentation. The first one is that to the extent that China is large, or any country that's potentially heterogeneous, and to the extent that policy has heterogeneous effects across the country, you probably want to think about the sample selection. That if you think about want to think about a policy that is going to benefit in the average places of the country when you roll out, you might want to have the sample that's close to being representative than having just simply the coastal regions or some selected regions. Okay, so we're going to look at sort of how selective is the sample. Now, when China introduced the policy experimentation in 1980, the concept of RCT has not even been introduced yet. So, but sort of we want to look at sort of how representative and how quote unquote randomized what's the sample selection. The second feature we're gonna look at is that to the extent that local governments' effort and sort of resources or sort of during the policy trial period plays an important role in how effective the policy will be, and to the extent that the local governments under trial for when the policy learning is being conducting might have hyper sort of attention and hyper sort of monitoring by the central government, they might have exert more efforts and more resources to the policy at trial, and those extra efforts and those extra resources may not be replicable when you roll out the policy to the entire country. So there might be some, you can think about this as a sort of meta experimental demand effects, where when you try something and then those government officials who know they're being sort of monitored, they might do a lot more things that otherwise they wouldn't do, and that might generate inflation to the signal you receive. Okay, so we're going to look at sort of whether the situation of the experimentation is representative compared to what a steady state or a normal sort of policy environment looks like. Okay, so we're going to look at, is the sample selection representative? Are there excessive efforts by the local governments when they're under trial? And finally, how sophisticated is central government to take into account of sample selection, to take into account of non-representative sort of experimental situation when they draw signals from these trials? Okay, so that's our goal. Now, before we get there, let me briefly describe to you sort of what sort of data sets we constructed. This is our sort of COVID pet project when we're sort of sitting at home and couldn't run field work. We try our best to build data sets. So this is all coming from sort of public available data sets, coming from the universe of all the legal documents database and regulation documents in China. We take out among the universe of legal documents 20,000 documents that mentioned that describe the institution of policy trials. Okay, so these are sort of among those 20,000 documents, 4,000 documents, roughly 4,000 documents are central government's initial calling for let's try out a policy in a couple of places, and those documents tell us sort of how central government selected those places and what's the timeline and so on. Okay, it's going to be also a lot of local government documents who provides details about when the local government is being called upon to join the experimentation. They oftentimes issue their own documents to provide additional details and other things they would like to try. So overall, we have about sort of 633 policy trials over the course of the last 4 decades. This is fairly aggressive in the sense of even if the policy sort of evolve over time, changes name, include additional features, we're going to still call that the same policy trials and just have multiple waves. Okay, so overall we have about 633 policy trials. This should include all the policy sort of trials that have initiated by the central government, but there are obviously going to be sort of potential policy ideas that sort of local governments initiated, central government never even considered to try, and that will not be included in this database. Okay, so what at the high level, what does those trials looks like? On the left panel here, I'm showing you over the course of the last 4 decades, the number of policy trials that's been initiated in a particular year over time. Okay, so you see a general pattern of there are more and more trials happening as we speak. There's some plateau over the last couple of years, but broadly speaking, it's increasing. About 55% of the policy trials did not lead to a national policy. Okay, so you can think about this as there are probably something meaningful learning going on that among the potential already positive selected policy trials of sort of set, central government killed 55% of the policy by the end of the trial period, and then only 45% of the policies end up becoming a national policy. Okay, so the question is, what did they actually what leads to them to screen out those 55% of the policies, which we'll see in a second. On the right-hand side, I'm plotting the cumulative number of trials that each locality in China has been participating over the last four decades. Okay, so as already you can see that the coastal regions in China have darker color, which means that they're participating in higher number of trials, and you might start to worry about the trials that systematically potentially are concentrated in the coastals and richer regions in China than average places in the country. Okay, so how representative are the site selection? Now, there are many ways one can show this. A simple way is that we can consider each of the 633 policy trials as an experiment, and we'll compare the places that are being selected to be part of the trials versus the places that are not. Compare the pre-experimentation characteristics and use the t-statistics, again, very standard in the RCT literature to think about how far away you are from being representative. A t-stats equal to 0 means that it's exactly representative, that the difference between the treatment and versus the control group are exactly identical. And the t-stats here, if it's positive, means that the places that are being selected as experimentation sites are on average richer before the experiment started. Okay. Yes. So we're gonna. Everything I'm showing you here, it actually doesn't matter whether you do it on level, do it on the 5-year trend and so on. This pattern is incredibly robust regarding whatever level you pick. Okay. So here, but just as a baseline, I'm showing you the pre-experimentation average 3-year GDP per capita in the local region. Okay, so in this figure, I'm plotting the 633 t-stats. Okay, so each one experiment has a t-stats, and the basic takeaway from this figure is that vast majority of the t-stats is bigger than 0, which means that for more than 90% of the policy trials that happened in China in the last 4 decades, they're happening in a substantially richer places than average places in China. Okay, and again, this is an incredibly robust pattern, no matter what variable you pick, because they're mostly positively correlated to begin with. Okay, in fact, just picking GDP per capita is probably underestimated the pattern. You can pick fiscal capacity and so on, and you're going to see even stronger positive selection. We can obviously allow for randomness, that it doesn't need to be precisely 0 for the t-stats, but even do a very conservative check, we can reject that 2/3 of the policies are happening in the representative region. Okay, that's fact number 1. Result number 2. What happened to the local government's efforts during the period of the experimentation? The first thing I want to show is that local governments are under a lot of political incentive to do well in the policy trial. So in the first 2 columns here, I'm showing the regression that if you're a local government official, how many experimentation you have gone through under your tenure to predict how likely you're going to get promoted to the next level. The first 2 columns suggest that being part of more experimentation itself doesn't quite help you to get promoted compared to everything, holding many other things constant. However, if you look at columns 3 and 4, being part of more successful experiments, meaning that those experimentation leads to national policy rollout, that substantially increases those local governments' promotion. And this is going to be a bread and butter kind of incentive for the local government's condition. Now, for the local governments who want to make a policy successful, what can they do? There's many things under the discretion. Here I'm showing you an exercise of we can match each of the policy to a particular policy domain. If this is education policy, we can match it to the education spending in the domain. If this is about agricultural policy, we can look at the local agricultural fiscal budgets in the region. If you throw a lot of money at the policy domain, it's going to make things look slightly better and make whatever central government is evaluating probably slightly more positive. Okay, so this regression is showing you that during the period of the policy tryout, in the particular domain where the trials is happening, local governments are shifting on average about half a percentage point more fiscal budget to the precise domain, and that is moving out of some other category to that particular category. Okay, so that means that there are things that are being moving out, and local governments are pushing in to the policy domain, potentially try to inflate and try to make the things look slightly better. Now, what's potentially problematic from a learning perspective is that when half the policy gets rolled out to the whole country, we can look at when it rolled out to the whole country and the places who get the policy for the first time, did the local governments at that time allocate a similar amount of more resources to those policy domains? And that's what's shown in panel B here. The sort of the very close to zero coefficient here suggests that when the same policy rolls out to the whole country, it doesn't come with the half a percentage point more fiscal input, and so that might start to make you worry about the sort of inflated signal that central government might get from this. Okay, I want to spend the last couple of minutes to think about sort of is the central government sort of sophisticated in figuring this out or sort of debiasing from this. Now, we don't know exactly what central government is using to evaluate the policy, but we can sort of backward engineer what trial outcome predicts the rollout probability of the policy. Okay, so on this figure, I'm showing you that a very naive sort of pre and post estimator to simply compare the post-policy experimentation GDP per capita in the region that the policy was under trial minus the pre-level is extremely strong predictive of whether the policy roll out to the whole country or not. That means that this estimator does not take into account the site selection. There's no control group in that. It also doesn't take into account of all the other potential inputs into the. It's just like probably the most naive estimator that one can think of. Okay, but that turns out to be by far among all the things we tried the biggest predictor of what makes a policy become a national policy. Okay. Now, if you study any sort of applied microeconomics, you know that there are many things that you can do to make the estimator slightly more sophisticated to take out the estimator. For example, you can control for provincial trend to start to think about selection. You can do synthetic control to really match the trial city to a comparable cities. Once you do those more sophisticated estimator, that would take out sample selection biases to take out potential sort of the additional efforts and so on. We don't see those estimators to be very strongly predictive of the rollout anymore. Okay, now the one last thing I want to show you is that we can see, let me show you two more things. One is that now you might worry that because central governments are not taking this into account, this means that when for half the policy will roll out to the whole country, we might see a systematic sort of deflation of the effect. Okay, so that's actually what we see. If we put sort of the experimentation sort of effects of the policy estimated during experimentation on the x-axis, the post-experimentation, the national effect when the policy rolls out to the whole country on the y-axis, you see that more than 2/3 of the dots are falling behind the 45-degree line, which means that you see a smaller effect when the policy goes to the whole country than the effect that you can observe during the trial period. Okay, so that's potentially something worrisome. The final thing that's potentially worrisome is that we find a pattern that when the policy rolls out to the whole country, those national policy are systematically benefiting places in terms of growth to the places that look similar to the policy at trial. Okay, so which means that, and what are those places on the policy trial happening? Those are richer places. Which means that on average, throughout this process, we end up having a lot of national policies that systematically start to benefit richer places and start to sort of on net hurt poor places, or at least not helping poor places as much. Okay, so you think about this broadly speaking as a sort of a learning procedure that might be biasing towards the rich places just because the whole learning environment is very heavily concentrated in richer places and places with more local government efforts and capacity than the average places in China. Okay. Now, what I want to end with the discussion is that this is not an easy problem to solve in the sense of because it's probably precisely because of China's bureaucratic structure and high level of government sort of coordination that make learning at this scale even possible to begin with. But that also means that when you start to think about policy learning at this scale, this is not going to happen in a political vacuum. So you need to think about very complicated incentive structure where local governments might be very keen on making policy to work that might generate sort of inflation effects. Local governments might want to give the policy to the best places that have a shot to make the policy work better. If you try a policy in Shanghai, and chances are, regardless of the policy, it's probably going to work. But that's going to potentially biasing the policy learning. Now, the solution is not going to be that straightforward because you probably don't want to cut off the efforts because local government's efforts and initiating local government's efforts is probably the line shares of what makes a policy work in the first place. So the question is, how do we want to design an incentive structure where local government's efforts are not disproportionately large during the trial period, where you can still maintain a level of local government's input during the national rollout of those policies. And you can think about this as a sort of stress test of how probably the largest scale policy learning in recent history, and you see this sort of a very interesting and intriguing interaction of the existing political sort of distortions and incentives that might distort and bias the learning procedure. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot to DAL for the invite. This has been a very interesting week, learning a lot and sharing a lot with very interesting people and researchers. The invite, and this talk will, I think it will link very well with what David was saying just by the end of his chat. Because I currently work at the Budget Office of the Ministry of Finance in Chile. And basically our job there is like to come up with all these technical things and try to talk to politicians and say like, oh, well, maybe you should try and look at the evidence before doing things, right? And things which for us are completely obvious, like, well, of course we should randomize everything. Of course we should do it. We should look at the figures before we decide things. But that's not often the case. So, is it? Okay. So yeah, I mean, at first I had evidence-based decision-making in public policies. At first, this slide had actually question marks at the end. Okay, do actually do this? Yeah, it's unfortunately not as frequent as it should. And this is regardless of political, I believe it's regardless of political considerations. It's not only because it's commonly said that politicians are very much concerned about voting and electoral cycles and everything, but it also has a lot to do with administrative processes that are embedded within the bureaucracies, right? It's hard to change. It's difficult to change. You have limited space for innovation. You have limited space to try and fail. Right. So yes, many times when we speak about RCTs and experimental policy, people will like come back like, "Are you really serious? You want to do this?" You know. And so our job, in a way, is to try to link these two worlds in terms of doing frontier edge side research and actually being able to use that in order to actually make some decisions. Yeah, inertia and risk aversion, they often prevail. So so often you're going to find someone say like, well, yeah, that's very interesting. That's really cool what you did, but why don't we just keep it that way? You know, not the time is not the right time. It's too complicated, right? We might fail. We might not execute our budget. And you know, when you any one of you that has been close to a public servant, not executing your budget is like the worst thing that can happen to you, right? So yes, most countries have or say they have sophisticated or not so sophisticated monitoring and evaluation systems, and but the real challenge is actually using them. You know, you have a lot of data, you have a lot of information, bunch of indicators. The question again is, how do you use them? When do you use them? And the same is true as regarding experimental policies. I mean, was that what David was saying just now? Huge number of examples, huge intentions, not necessarily done in a way that actually you're going to learn something from it, and not necessarily. And even when you do it in the way that you're going to learn from it, you're not necessarily going to use that information in order to actually make decisions. What we're doing in Chile, and or trying to do, I was kind of complicated using the word lessons because I'm not sure we can really preach about whether any of this is working completely. We're trying to, though. Okay, so I'm going to just walk you through the context and then how experimental policies fit in within this. Our monitoring and evaluation system is targeted at 3 stages. One of them is the ex-ante evaluation. This is for new programs and reformulated programs. This sometimes comes to do something as simple as saying, sit down with the people from the line ministries and saying like, okay, what is it that you want to do? Who are you going to target this to? How are you going to do it? And how are you going to measure it? So just so simple questions that many times so often they're not really well answered, right? Then we have the monitoring of programs. This is done on a yearly basis. We're currently monitoring over 700 programs. And of course, this is not deep, detailed assessment, but it's monitoring. It's like to see what you find. See when something smells fishy, you need to look into this. And that leads to further ex post analysis, or sometimes, if it's fairly clear, to the reformulation of the program. And then for a limited number of programs each year, around 15, between 15 and 25, we do ex post evaluation. We review designs, implementation efficiency, and another group we do impact assessment. Okay, so how it works is that sometimes from the monitoring of the program, okay, you get some of the reasons like, okay, you got selected for a really deeper ex post analysis because something doesn't seem to be right. Other elements, sometimes when it's perfectly clear that something is not working and you're already from the monitoring, you have an idea of what's going on, sometimes you send them immediately back to the ex ante evaluation stage in order to get reformulated. I mean, this often happens when you're not talking about new programs, but actually programs that lost their way a long time. You know, they just don't know what they're doing anymore. And other way of getting to that stage of having an ex ante for reformulating the program is after an ex post evaluation, then you go back. Okay, now that we really know what's going on with you, let's sit back down and start again. Okay. So what are the areas where we can actually push in experimental policies here? We can work it both, either in new programs and in impact assessment. And I believe here is the most, at the time when you need to find the right time to use these ideas and use these methodologies in order to be able to really have an incidence in the budget cycle, right? I mean, as long as you do assessments and you do, and even regardless whether your methodology is extremely robust and your results are very clear, if you don't happen to answer the right question at the right time, it's useless in terms of public policy, right? So yes, you probably going to get to publish a paper in a top-tier journal, and you have the results, and you have methodology and everything. It's very cool, but no one probably is not ever going to use it. So the key issue here, and what we try most to do, is like to find the balance between answering relevant questions with robust and cool methodologies, but try to do it at the time when actually making decisions about it. And two areas in which you can do this, probably the one where it's the easiest, and probably in terms of public policy formulation, the wisest, is to do it for new programs, especially when you have limited resources, and then you have the opportunity of, okay, why don't we try this out before we actually do it in general? Something which seems so obvious, you know, and probably in any other field of work, it's not that obvious here, okay? So there you have an opportunity. And the other is when you're doing impact assessment of an existing programs. So, wait a second. Oh, yeah. Regarding new programs, I forgot there was another thing coming in here. We're trying and we're doing randomized control trials for new programs, thinking about expanding on conditional results. And the other area is programs that probably in which there's a political decision that it's already been made in terms of the program that will eventually be universal. But it's not completely clear right now whether that program is the specific components and the mechanisms that you will use. So you want to do it, you're trying this, but on the way of being universal, you can actually test different things and adjust them as you go. So that's one area. The other area is when you work with randomized controlled trials on existing programs with allocation flexibility, that you really need the collaboration, and you need partners on your on the line ministries and the services. Basically, you have to allocate subsidies. You have to allocate this program, and sometimes you have the space and in the margin in order to do some randomized allocation. This, of course, limits the number of experiments you can do, and sometimes, I guess, it actually biases the areas in which where you can do it. Right? It's not necessarily random where you can or where you cannot. So it's basically you're just looking for chances, right? And same thing with a natural experiment. What we usually do is like and it's probably many times you were writing papers and theses, everything, just like being lucky enough to find somewhere that actually someone did something in a way in which you can test whether it worked, you know? And yes, sometimes the design, many times by chance, not by rational design, they give you those opportunities. That's, of course, very dependent on data. And one thing we've been trying in the last 3 years with a lot of, with big success, using information treatments to see whether they impact results. Those are not, we're not working on typical programs, housing subsidies or this, that, but more on administrative processes. So actually right now we're working with a health insurance, public health insurance, looking at paid medical leave from doctors. Who is sending them out on why, giving them information to the doctors and see whether they change in putting nudges on their behavior. Same thing with public procurement. And the one which is related to traditional public programs, we're working with information sent to different mechanisms of information sent to receivers of the housing voucher program for rentals. So see where they rent, how they rent, and the probability of. So we're just trying different information treatments there. The change in the last few years was very much in formalizing this and gearing up in terms of the methodologies used. Before, I mean, we've been doing impact assessment for a while now, but not really experimental in the previous stage. A lot of matching techniques and stuff like that. Lately, we are concentrating in both in natural experiments, both with IV and RDD strategies, and trying to rely heavily on RCTs. How? Well, we're following two strategies here. One is internal evaluations, which we're working. Our research from our team, we pair up with academic advisors from outside. And we're basically what we're doing is that looking for opportunities, both in existing programs and both in programs that are coming up. And we pair up, we select the assessment based on availability, and we do a competitive process to call upon people who are actually going to be our advisors in this, like the seal of approval of whether we're doing right or not, and ask the difficult questions sometimes you don't get to ask yourself. And the other strategy is the Impact Evaluation Fund. What we're doing there, this has been done for 3 years already. It's an open call for proposals. Most relevant thing here is that, well, we're trying to put together the incentives from the academics. And the need to come up with good research. You need the commitment of the local authorities in charge of the program that you're assessing, evaluating. And because, I mean, we need to make sure, if we're going to give you money on time, that you're going to have the data and you're going to have the commitment from the persons responsible for this. We are getting allocations in the range of $100,000 to $400,000 a year for different programs, and we give different amounts of money depending whether you need to do field work or not. And we give extra credit in terms of being selected if you're using administrative data, because that way you can do more things with the same way. So selection criteria, it's just depending on the identification strategy. Very important, it's the relevance of the policy, how innovative it is, and the potential scale up of it. And that's taken into consideration. Of course, the availability, the implementation, and yes, of course, the scientific productivity and architectural background of researchers. So I mean, this is all public, transparent, this is open. Get the projects, rank them down, see what, and then publish the results. It's been done for 3 times already. In 2019, we selected programs in entrepreneurial innovation program. There was an IDD. The one I was talking about before in terms of entrepreneurial innovation and public savings. We've been having trouble with the pandemic and actually making some of the things actually happen. We're just not extremely unlucky as many others. For instance, this program with preventing patrol policing, we're like experimenting different ways of patrolling the different territories with an RCT. of course, that's been taking much longer than we thought it would. And the one in information treatment and housing vouchers, fraudulent use of medical leave, they're starting just now. Digital talent and long-term effect of residents in protection for abused children. That's an instrument variable approach. Working with people from Chilean universities, but also we have colleagues and partners in mainly in the UK and in the US. So what I mean is that this calls, they're open. You can apply, of course. The only restriction is that you need to apply with someone from locally based, from a local university, and of course, which is a little bit harder if you're far away, is you need to get to know someone or get the backing of the minister in charge of the policy you're evaluating. So, but you have a local partner, and it can be done. It has been done, and we are actually working with researchers from different countries. Just as a matter of just three kinds of examples. The one on public savings in public procurement, we're getting. I mean, the test there. We're finding like 19% reduction in overpaying, 33% reduction in overspending, as compared to the control group. This is an RCT. There's another RCT too in a program called Mi Abogado. This is my lawyer. This is for kids in residences, right? What's your word in English? Oh, so this is a probability in each case of girls and boys to be actually getting back to a family, either their family or an extended family, and not staying in the residence, protection residence. So we're going to find an impact there. That's been done by professors at the Joseph Doyle at MIT and professors at the School of Government in Universidad Católica. Also trajectories in conviction rate, when we find significant results. And of course, computer preparation program, we call it Yo elijo mi PC, I choose my laptop. This is the, I don't know, we've probably seen many times. Well, in Chile, it doesn't work either. One laptop per child, we allocate them given test scores and like a prize to good students. And believe it or not, they keep on being good students later on. And you're not reducing any gap on anything. Actually, you're highlighting existing traits already. So, yes. So, 2 minutes, challenges ahead and opportunities. I said this before, they need to answer the right question at the right time. This is not easy in this type of assessments. Many times your trials, you cannot do the field work, you get different problems. And to do the fine tuning in order to get the answer at the right time is very hard. So you need to be very cautious approach, manage expectations, just don't get ahead of yourself and promise something that you might not be able to give the right answer just at the time of the budget calendar year, right? Scaling up, we need to, we're trying to prioritize interventions in areas which we might use, find similar problems and use similar approaches, so we can, from these learnings, actually use them in other programs and functions, public functions. And we need to do a better job at promoting an evaluation culture among the civil servers. We need partners. We need counterparts. And we definitely need to work on that. In terms of opportunities, right now, we've been just in the middle of a change of administration, and we are starting a new budget cycle. So basically coming in right now, we're thinking about the budget for next year, and we're expecting, this is a process that starts the day after tomorrow, for the ex-ante analysis of new programs coming in. And we're expecting a big wave of new programs and new ideas and new challenges. And of course, we have a limited budget. So we're probably going to see a space for come back at them and say, like, OK, we'll not do this year, at least not completely. And we're actually going to do a pilot. And yes. And the thing is, when we're meeting with a pilot, I'm not thinking about an underfinanced program. Many times they call them pilots because you don't have enough money to put in them, but you're just underfinancing them. No, but actually doing a pilot, meaning randomizing, doing it in a way in which you can learn about it. So a big opportunity there. And the last thing, something that Michael mentioned yesterday in terms of social innovation funds and the way we can involve with the civil society. We're facing, as Australians call them, the wicked problems. Like very difficult for government agencies to coordinate, to go around. Many times you can use the help from the private sector, from civil society, innovate, try, and if it works, see whether you can scale up. This is very hard in terms of implementation within the public service. I mean, if regular impact assessment is already too complicated, here and then you get a lot of contracts and lawyers inside, and it's complicated. It's much more complicated. But still, there's a huge area here to expand and to look forward to doing cool methodological approaches to solve problems we're not being able to resolve right now. I'm not going all the details of the programs that we've been testing in the last few years. They're online or on our website. We have a mother document which is in English where you can download and take the information. I'm going to share the link later on. And again, I want to thanks everyone here. Thanks to people that actually are right here right now that used to work with us in Chile. One is Antonia Sanhuesa, who's here with us, and Ryan Cooper, who is the head of the Waste Fund, the DIL. And both of them are very much responsible for what we've been trying to do the last few years. So I'd like to thank them and thank you for your attention.
Great. Well, thank you both for those excellent presentations. Really thought-provoking. So David, I'll start with you. Your presentation illustrated some of the ways that policy experimentation in China can, let's say, deviate from the ideal, what we might think of the ideal as researchers, right? Representative samples. I'm curious on your thoughts on if the Chinese government was aware of your results. I mean, one, do you think they would do anything to sort of veer back towards the ideal? And, you know, if so, what? And could they do that?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And this is something that I was trying to convey in the end, where it is not clear exactly what are the things that government can do in this environment to make things better. I think there's low-hanging fruit, such as you could use a slightly more sophisticated estimator to pick the right policy. That's probably easy to resolve. But I think the bigger question is probably the reason why the non-representative sample selection and then the excessive efforts was in place was there for a good reason, that the central government understand, and I think this is not unique to China, that for most policies, you sort of have to create an environment where local governments have a lot of incentive to work hard and try hard and make it work. The policy itself, the nature of the policy is probably sort of more or less is identical, and what makes policy really effective is how much input the local government puts. And then the current structure is more or less in place such that local governments has a lot of incentive to make whatever central government would like them to work actually work. And now once you remove those kind of incentives, it will potentially give you a more unbiased sort of signal of the policy effectiveness, but you're also going to kill maybe the line shares of the input of what makes the policy work in the first place. So then I think the problem is much harder. And the trade-off is unbiased learning on one end, but also sort of just overall sort of the effect of the policy having a lot of motivated local politicians. So the central governments, I think in China right now, is probably erring more on the side of we can give up some unbiased learning, but we really don't want to sacrifice any opportunity to motivate local officials. So I think sort of thinking about how to do policy learning in the environment where that's not a political vacuum is academically and intellectually interesting and extremely challenging, because in some sense RCT is make the problem a lot simpler because you remove a lot of the problems in a political environment. But then when policy learning happening at a massive scale, then you have to think very carefully about who is even having incentive to participate in the experiment, and how do you induce them to have incentives. And it's not a problem that's easy to solve, I think.
Great, thank you. Slaven, so you mentioned the recent change in government in Chile. And so I was actually talking to a DIL colleague last night, Pablo Peña, about how there used to be a similar office in Mexico, but it sort of got shut down after a change in administration. So I'm curious what your thoughts are in terms of how offices like yours can sort of succeed administrations and political changes, and how you're thinking the future will look like in your office.
Yes, well, actually, we had the change in administration in the beginning of March until now, and I'm confident that we're not looking at or expecting major changes in what we're doing. On the contrary, the new authorities, they came in with a lot of support on the work that my division had been doing, and not only in terms of impact assessment, but especially in the terms of accountability and fiscal transparency. This is an important thing to say, because it's not only about evidence-based decision making. It's not necessarily comes out of RCTs and RDs and IVs, but also about the public being able to understand what you're doing with the budget. So you need to put your budget in a way that people can understand, comprehend what's behind it, and having everything like your kitchen, a restaurant with the kitchen completely open, so people actually can see what you're doing. That's a much probably easier way, also to use evidence-based evidence for decision making. And the new authorities, previous authorities, and the new ones, they see this as a state policy. This is not understood as a government-specific intervention. It's understood that this is a long-term state policy, and there's a way actually in which this will be even more robust in the future. Is that just now we're starting with following up the example of the Australian and New Zealand productivity commissions. We have a productivity commission which is now also set up in the terms of being the productivity and evaluation commission, which is, it depends from the government, but it has much a greater degree of independence. It's designed in a way in which the people who work there and they're part of the council, they stay in periods which are longer than the regular political cycles, and they come up as being like, in a way, like a board of what the fiscal agencies are doing inside. So, in a way, they are not the case of the independent fiscal assessment agencies, which you see in some countries. Some of them are very independent, very highly robust methodologies, but very low incidence in what actually gets done. Maybe you become just another external. This is somewhere in the middle. This is like a board that is overseeing what we're doing. Someone who is there for the longer run, and to whom we have to explain why we're doing what we're doing, and that also helps us to do things looking at the long run and not only at the shorter political cycles. So yes, we're pretty optimistic about being able to keep on doing these things.
Great. Thank you. So maybe I'll ask one more question and then open it up to the audience. This question is for both of you. So one of the goals of the Development Innovation Lab is to bring innovations to scale. And in Michael Kramer's keynote address yesterday, he spoke about how that process often involves iterative experimentation. But even after identifying successful pilots, it's hard to predict which will succeed at scale, and then often making that transition from pilot to scale is quite challenging, and you both spoke about this. So I'm curious if you have any advice that you'd offer governments in China, Chile, or elsewhere about how to approach this challenge of identifying policies that are likely to succeed at scale.
Yeah, that's should I go first? So that's it's like $1 million question for the government. It feels like if you take any lessons from China's case, one thing that I skipped in the presentation, the full procedure of the policy learning in China was that central government wasn't sitting there to come up with all the ideas. It was in almost all cases, it's local governments who are really pushing the boundary, who think about a new sort of things that was not currently under the policy sort of domain in China. They come up with the policy, central government learned about it very quickly, and the central government deciding, should we kill it right away or should we engage them into this learning procedure? Now the question is that there are many policies central government might kill too soon before giving it even a chance. And there are policies that probably go through this procedure where central government using whatever the judgment to think, considering all the other political considerations and so on, to think, okay, there might be a chance this policy can be scaled up, and then they go through this procedure. Now, I think, and in the onset, I think this is a good process of at least giving many policies a try to go beyond, you know that this one location who come up with the policy idea must be benefiting from it, otherwise they wouldn't try out the policy. And then the question is that once you take those ideas and give it to potentially some places that are extremely different from the places that get the policy, that will give you a very strong signal of whether this policy will become a more useful national policy. And that can be, I think, much more sort of institutionalized in a sort of maybe having some very small signals first, and then before going to this very large scale coordination the central government is engaging in. So there could be a lot more sort of small steps in the middle to sort of making sure that all the policy ideas that would have potential sort of, don't get killed too early. And vice versa. I think the thing I showed today is like there are many policies who don't have much sort of potential, don't get killed very soon, and that problem is also on the symmetric side. So I think that there is, considering both sides, is useful to think about what are all the universe of policy ideas that could have a chance to become a national policy.
I guess it's harder to scale up when you're thinking about innovative policies or innovative programs. When you're doing innovation, someone comes up with an idea and we try it, whether it works, and then we see if we can. But there's not necessarily a political commitment beforehand. So the scaling up is but often much harder in those cases. And when it's easier, but then it's when you have the political commitment to do something, but you don't know how to do it yet. So there you have a very narrow edge between just jumping in and doing without you knowing what you're doing, just universal, and being able to get in the middle, say like, okay, we'll do this universally. Don't be afraid of that, but let's not just do it immediately. In those areas, when you manage to hit that string, it's like in a way like the jackpot in terms of being able to, it's going to be scaled up, you have the political commitment to it, and you have the chance of spending 1 or 2 years actually trying different things before you do it. If you manage to do that, the scaling up is trivial, and it's probably a better way to do, it's for sure the better way to do public policy. I guess the caveat is that when there is a strong political commitment, you're also usually in a hurry. So that's where you need to try to get in the middle.